Hey guys, welcome back to the Foodie Dietitian channel. My name is Carmen and I'm an accredited practicing dietitian from Sydney, Australia. And I hope everyone is doing really well this week. I know we all had some really good news here in Australia that we can finally go out and visit our friends and family. So, I'm really happy about that. So I thought that this week I might kick off my carbohydrate series that I plan on doing. And so this week I'm going to be talking about the very basics of carbs, what a carb is, the different kinds of starches and sugars there are, and then we'll be touching on a little bit about low GI as well, so what the glycemic index means. So if you guys are interested in this topic, then keep on watching. Okay, so starting off, what exactly is a carbohydrate? So a carbohydrate in terms of nutrition is a macronutrient. It provides us with our main source of energy in the form of glucose, which is what our cells use to convert into adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is that main energy currency in our body. So every move that we make, every muscle that we flex, we use ATP. So we really do run on glucose. It is our fuel. So carbohydrate foods are very important, but not all carbs are made equal. So carbohydrates are actually organic molecules that are made up of saccharides, or what we call sugars. So in essence, what a carbohydrate is made up of a bunch of sugars that are bonded together. So they could be very large molecules with lots of sugar molecules, but they can also be single molecules of sugar, or what we call monosaccharides. There are two main families of carbs that I wanted to talk about, the ones that are important in nutrition, the ones that we can actually metabolize and digest. And so we have our starches, which is our one family, and then we also have sugars. So let's start off with starches. So starches are what we call polysaccharides. So they're actually made up of hundreds of these sugar molecules that are bonded together. We have two main components of starch. So the main component we have is called amylopectin, and it is made up of lots of glucose molecules bonded together, and it's got more of a branched structure with all these glucose molecules. And it's very easy for our bodies to digest and metabolize because of this structure. So it just sort of gets digested in our gut, in our stomach, in our small intestine, and then that glucose becomes very readily available and can be very efficiently metabolized. So it's a very sort of quick, fast source of energy for us. Now the other kind of starch that we have is amylose, and we call this one our resistant starch. And the reason for that is because of its tightly wound helical structure, which I'll show here. It actually makes it more resistant to digestion in our small gut. And so what happens is it bypasses our stomach and our small intestine and ends up in our large bowel, where it gets fermented. Now this sounds really gross, but it's actually not. It's actually very good for our gut health. It promotes a good, nice, healthy gut because it promotes the growth of good, healthy bacteria. And so amylose is less likely to be broken down in our stomach, so we don't really actually use it as a form of energy. It sort of acts more like a fiber rather than a source of energy for us. Now the other family of carbohydrates I mentioned before were sugars. Now sugars are different from starches in the sense that they're smaller molecules of saccharides. So we have either disaccharides, which is made up of two sugar molecules bonded together, and we also have monosaccharides. So something like glucose, the sugar that we run on, is actually a monosaccharide in its simplest form. Now, although our body actually needs glucose, when we're talking about our standard sort of modern day Western diet, most of the sugar that we get doesn't come from glucose. It comes from sucrose, which is our table sugar that we so commonly find in our supermarket. It's the sugar that we add to our cooking, we add to our baking, that we find in all of our packaged, processed sweetened goods and our sweetened beverages like our soft drinks and our juices and things like that. So sucrose is probably the most prevalent kind of sugar that we have in a modern day diet. Now, sucrose is a disaccharide. It's made up of a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule bonded together, and I'll show you guys here. And so when our body metabolizes it, it needs to actually break down that bond between the glucose and the fructose, convert the fructose into glucose before we can actually metabolize it. Now, there are other forms of sugars commonly found in our diet. We have fructose, which is found in fruit and vegetables. It is a monosaccharide, so it is a little bit different from glucose. It's got a pentagon shape rather than a hexagon shape. And likewise, our bodies need to convert it first into glucose before we can use it. We also have lactose as another form of sugar that's found in our foods. It's found in our dairy foods like milk and cream, yogurt and cheese. And this is also a disaccharide. So it consists of a galactose and a glucose bonded together. And it's the same thing as with the sucrose. Our bodies need to break it apart and convert it into glucose first before using it. Now, there are also a lot of other different kinds of sugars out there, countless ones. I can't even list them all here, but a lot of the times food industry will use different kinds of sugars, whether it be sort of a cheaper way to sweeten foods. I know that in the US they use high fructose corn syrup as sort of a cheaper way to sweeten foods, and they can use less of it because it is sweeter. But we also use other kinds of sugars like maltose syrup or glucose syrup, especially in making our sweetened products like our biscuits and pastries and things like that. And sometimes companies just want to be able to change the texture of foods. But in general, we can tell something is a sugar on the ingredients list when it ends with an OSE, an OSE. And that usually is a good indicator that it is a kind of added sugar. So now that we've talked about our carbs, let's talk a little bit more about GI and what it actually means. Now, GI stands for glycemic index, and what it really is actually a rating system. It scores foods from a scale of 0 to 100 in terms of how much and how quickly it raises our blood sugar. GI is not only determined by the amount of carbs in a food, and that's what we call a glycemic load. So, something that is higher in carbs will give it a higher GI naturally because it just will make our blood sugars go up more. But it also is determined by the glycemic response of that particular carbohydrate. So how quickly is our body able to break it down and metabolize it and turn it into energy? In saying that, how quickly it makes our blood sugars go up. So there's those two factors that determine the glycemic index. Now, the higher the GI, the quicker it raises our blood sugar. So in theory, pure 100% glucose, if you just drank glucose out of a bottle, which I don't recommend you do, will have a GI of 100 because our body doesn't really need to do anything to break it down. It just goes straight into our bloodstream and our body instantly recognizes it as glucose. Then, we have that insulin response, and the insulin tells our cells, let's open our cells up and invite all that sugar in so we can turn it into energy. So the lower GI of food, the slower that energy gets produced and gets released in a way. And why do we want something with a lower GI? Well, it sort of makes sense, right? We don't want to have something and give us a whole lot of energy in one go and then feel like a crash afterwards. Obviously, when we eat a meal, we want to feel satisfied and feel full for a longer period of time and have that sustained energy throughout the day. I know that elite athletes, marathon runners might want to big hit of sugar in one go because they need it. You know, they really need that ongoing fuel to help them run marathons. But we're not all marathon runners. We are trying to stay healthy, and if we're not really active, we should be going for foods that give us that longer release of energy throughout the day, so we're not, you know, just piling on the carbs, piling on the energy. So low GI is also particularly important, I guess, for people who have metabolic damage, people with insulin resistance or diabetes, and people with polycystic ovarian syndrome, which sort of exhibit those same, I guess, symptoms as insulin resistance. There is an impaired response to sugar, and also an impaired response to the insulin that we release, or, you know, no insulin release at all. So our bodies don't know how to regulate our blood sugars. So it's important to go for low GI when we have metabolic damage, because we can sort of externally help regulate our blood sugars by not releasing all that sugar into our blood all in one go. So let's talk more about what makes a food lower in GI. That's why it was important for me to explain all those different carbohydrates before we move into GI, is because it's these different properties of carbs that determine that glycemic response that it elicits. So remember when we talked about the starches and how amylopectin would be very high GI because it's very easily broken down and digested in our bodies, whereas something that is higher in amylose or resistant starch would be lower GI because it doesn't get broken down into sugar. We don't digest it, and it goes straight to our large bowel. But other types of, like, typically starchy foods can be lower in GI if they are more unrefined, or they're as close to its natural form as possible. So if we look for those whole grain varieties, it'll naturally make them lower in GI, just because our body just needs to work that much harder to break it down before it, you know, gets broken down into glucose and metabolized. Also, foods that contain less of the glucose, which is the very readily available source of energy, and less of the sucrose, and more lactose or fructose, will be lower GI. Milk is low GI, whole fruit is low GI, but it's also important to remember that GI is also determined by the carbohydrate load, or the glycemic load in the food. Even if fruit is low GI, fruit juice will be high GI because it's very concentrated. It has a lot of fructose in it, so it'll still give you a significant sugar high because of just how concentrated it is. So we not only need to focus on the kind of sugar, but also how much of that sugar there is. I know that also some food companies might replace the addition of glucose and sucrose with something like fructose syrup, and that automatically makes it lower GI because fructose is just naturally a lower GI type sugar. But again, that doesn't mean that it is lower in sugar. So yeah, be careful, you know, read the labels and still be mindful of the amount of sugar that you're having. Yes, it's important to know what kind of sugar it is, but, you know, don't forget the fact that a high sugar food is a high sugar food. Okay, so what are the main points that I wanted to get across in this video? Well, the first thing is that it's just really important for us to choose our complex carbs over our refined carbs. So choosing those whole grains, whole grain bread, whole grain pasta, brown rice will naturally make it lower GI. And it also just takes longer for our bodies to digest and break it down, and it gives us more of a sustained source of energy throughout the day. Also try to go with foods that are higher in amylose or resistant starch. So foods like potatoes that have been cooled. Beans are also a really good source of resistant starch. And actually pasta is quite low GI once it's been cooked up and reasonably cooled down, is also a good low GI food. Now, the second point I wanted to make is that it's still very important that you read the ingredients list and take note of how much sugar or carbs there actually is in that food, because no matter how good that sugar is, no matter how sort of healthy or low GI that carbohydrate is, if you have too much of it, it's still too much sugar. So it's important to read the label, check the ingredients list, and if you can, try to use sugar in its whole form rather than focusing on sugar in its natural form. So if you can sweeten, for example, like your oatmeal with a tablespoon of dried fruit rather than a tablespoon of honey, or using a banana, and if we're baking cakes and things like that, using like applesauce or using fruit to sweeten our baked goods rather than adding a ton of sugar, that can help lower the GI, not only lower the GI but also lower the amount of sugar in general. So I hope you guys found this video helpful and informative, and it demystifies low GI for you. As you can tell, carbs are really not the devil. They are really important for our survival, for our energy that we need. So please don't stay away from carbs, but it's just about choosing the right kind of carbohydrates that's important. So yeah, I hope everyone has a great week ahead, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.